I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat. And I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time. Top Gun was really a thrill. I must have done well in actual combat because at the time I was just a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the Air Force. And so I may have been the very first lieutenant junior grade to go through Top Gun. That was the dream of a lifetime come true. I had wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot just like my dad from the time I was 10 years old. STS-27 was my third launch, and it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are gonna die. To be an airline pilot, there was mandatory age 60 retirement. I was a NASA astronaut until I was 50 years old. And so I looked at the situation, and I had known a number of Southwest airline pilots. And they were just like me. They were flying because they loved to fly. Well, there's a lot of piloting that goes into it, a tremendous amount of piloting that goes into it, because you're going to wind up passing other airplanes. You're going to get in a duel with another airplane that's fairly closely matched. So there's a ton of satisfaction from doing that. And hey, let's just talk about the racing itself. It's fun to fly low, but it's dangerous.
afternoon, folks. Welcome to our morning version of the Warbirds in Review. This is our 9th year, and we have a very rare airplane here today. It's the only surviving World War II airplane. It was in Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. This airplane belongs to this gentleman here, and this is Chuck Greenhill. And to give you a little information about him, he's been a pilot for 35 years, and he's an instructor pilot, and he specializes in seaplanes. He's been an EAA member since 1978, AMA since 1955, Army vet from 54 to 56. He's got an ATP, multi-engine, numerous ratings. He's flown all Grumman seaplanes and owned most of them, the Duck, the Widgeon, the Goose, Mallard, and the Albatross. He's a collector, and I put this in here, many World War II aircraft. And he regularly flies his Mustang Louis IV and Geraldine and raced at Reno, and he came in 4th, I believe, the bronze in 2010. He has 2 gentlemen here, or 3 actually. He's got Tony Barnum, he's the pilot here, had flew these airplanes, and he's going to interview him, and Derek Johnson and Bill Floden, who restored the airplane. Now this right here in front of you is what it kind of looked like when they started on it, and all of this, it really wasn't much left. But anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. And before I do it, I need to mention something, folks. On the military channel, many of you probably saw some of these missions that changed the war. We have the complete set of these as Doolittle, it's Germany's Last Ace, and we also have the Flying Tigers. That's available over there in the EAA Warbirds if you want to go and look at it and maybe purchase it. They're very, very well done. Okay, with that, I'm going to give it to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sam. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and at that day, this airplane was sitting at Ford Island. We lost 2,500 American servicemen, and at that raid, and that of course was the day President Roosevelt called the Day of Infamy. But anyway, this particular airplane was amongst 19 ducks that were sitting at the airfield at Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, and we have some pictures and stuff to really document that. Of course, a lot of the airplane is new, but we still have enough of it to say that this is the airplane. Anyway, we're going to talk about it in kind of phases. First, Bill Floden here is going to talk about how we recovered the airplane from a inland lake. It had gotten into civilian hands, and he himself was the guy who dove on it and pulled it out of the water. And anyway, he'll also give you a history of the airplane, where it was during the war years, and then we'll go on to Derek Johnson, who will tell you about how he restored it. He worked for the company, the Wichita Air Service, that did the restoration on the airplane. He'll give you some of the detail of that. Before we get started, though, I want to introduce Tony Barnum. Tony Barnum is a veteran from World War II, and he actually flew ducks in World War II, and we're really privileged to have a guy who is actually out there doing it. And of course, my hat's off to these fellas who really did all this stuff back then. But let me give you Tony Barnum, and then at the end I'll fill in. I'll talk about how the airplane flies and give you the detail of how I enjoy the airplane. But here's Tony Barnum.
Thank you for the introduction. I was a Navy test pilot in Special Weapons Tactical Test and Evaluation my entire 2 tour in the Navy. And I was stationed at the most beautiful naval air station and the most secret naval air station in the world, Traverse City, Michigan. And I lived out on Silver Lake. And I had a wonderful fly fishing experience living in Traverse City. The Grumman Duck was always close to my heart when I was a Navy pilot. Why we had one, I don't really know, but I think I towed gliders with it a few times. And its principal use in the Navy was a high-altitude observation aircraft. It has a hole in the middle of the fuselage for a Fairchild high-altitude camera. And this engine, you go up to about 15,000 feet, and then you throttle back and shift it into high blower and could go on up to 22,000 feet, which was very high in my day. And to make high altitude photographs. I think we photographed the entire part of northern Michigan for the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, with the Duck. I owned a Duck that I bought and restored, and it was the Grand Champion Warbird here probably 20 or 25 years ago. I've also had a Stagger Ring Beach, was a champion here that I restored. I have done nothing my whole life but fly airplanes. I have around 45,000 hours in an airplane. And I soloed when I was 14 years old, believe it or not. And within a few I remember just a few months after I soloed, I went out to corn husking contests and was taking people for airplane rides. I don't think I had 50 to 75 hours at the time. When I enlisted in the Navy, I had about 400 hours and went to Iowa pre-flight, where I was the national cross-country champion for the Navy in 1952. And I've always been an athlete. I went to college on an athletic scholarship. And the biggest mistake I ever made in my life is letting my body get fat. Oh, dumbest thing I ever did. But the Duck is a very docile airplane, very nice flying airplane, not very fast, but you can do just about any kind of aerobatics with it you want to. It's tough. It's a very tough airplane and can be used in fairly high wave situations for rescue work, which was what it was used for quite a bit in the Pacific. It also was, in addition to being a carrier landing and takeoff airplane, it was used on battleships and shot off of the battleship on a catapult and retrieved by the battleship making a big fast turn and making a slick alongside of itself and landing the Duck in the slick, and then coming up to the back of the cruiser and taxiing up against a big mesh net where they picked it up with a crane, put it back on the catapult. The airplane has a very varied life. It was built in the model was built beginning in 1932, discontinued in 1945. There were about 330 of them built. And the year that my Duck was a Grand Warbird champion, a man walked up to me and said, "You know, I test flew that Duck. I said, well, tell me your history. And he was the guy who, was it Columbia Aircraft that built them? Yeah. Columbia Aircraft built most of them, although they are called a Grumman Duck. And he said on every test flight, he had a big pocket full of pencils. And he'd land in the water and go down in the hull and stick pencils in the holes they forgot to rivet. And then take off and go back to the factory and they'd put the rivets in. The airplane is a very, very interesting airplane. It's unique among airplanes, and there are only, 5 or 6 left?
Yeah, there's about 3 of them flying now, Tony.
3?
About 3 flying.
3 of them in flying condition. The one I owned is in the museum at Tillamook, Oregon.
Tony, let me turn this over to Bill now.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, walk up to me later and I'll try to answer them.
We will have a question and answer session after this, folks.
Thanks, Tony. And now I'm going to take you to Bill Floden, who did the actual recovery and knows the history of this particular airplane intimately. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm going to start off with the history of this particular aircraft and then the early history of the Duck. The whole Duck story started with a guy by the name of Grover Loaning. Loaning is an early pioneer, contemporary of the Wrights, and he had his own airplane company, which he called Loaning Aeronautical and Engineering at the turn of the century. In 1919, a young guy who was a Navy test pilot joined that company as an extension from the Navy to test fly the M8 monoplane that Loaning was building. That guy's name was Leroy Grumman. Grumman was attached to the Navy at that time and worked with Loaning for about 1.5 years, and then joined the Loaning company 1.5 years later to develop what was called the Loaning amphibian. Now, the Navy approached Loaning and said, we need an amphibian scout plane. And so they developed one. Grumman actually engineered part of the Loaning amphibian and the retractable gear on the Loaning amphibian. And it was the OL8 through the OL5 series. They also built one they called, for the civilian market, called the Loaning Air Yacht. It first flew in 1923, and it looks like the predecessor of the Duck. Centerline float, small wingtips, bi-wing, open cockpit, front and back seating, and for all intents and purposes, an antique Duck. Flew in first in 1923, and they had it in the Canal Zone and spread around Alaska and so on and so forth. In the late 20s, Loaning decided he would accept a buyout. We all know what happened in 1929. Loaning was going to take a buyout from New York bankers, and they wanted to buy Keystone Aviation and move the whole Loaning company. At that time, Grumman cocked his house, came up with $16,000. Jake Swerble borrowed $6,000 for his mother. Ed Poole joined in, and a couple other guys, plus the Loaning employees, to start Grumman Aircraft in 1930. Their first endeavor were building floats for the Navy for a Navy observation airplane, building truck bodies, and doing repairs on Grumman Loaning amphibians. That kept them alive for the first couple of years till the Navy came calling again saying, hey, we need an updated Duck, essentially. They did the design, the Grumman company did the design, and turned out what was called the JF. Now keep in mind this is a J2F. The JF looked very, very similar to this. There are none known, at least none that I know of. If you guys know of where a JF is, underwater or on a hillside, I'd love to hear about it. And they were built in limited numbers as a scout observation airplane for the Navy. That started in 1932-33 period, and they decided that the water handling characteristics weren't that great, so they built the J2F, which is this. What's the difference? A little longer center line float for better water handling and a few other improvements. And they started the J2F series, first with the first experimental, and then the Dash 1, which is built in very limited numbers, Dash 2, Dash 3, and Dash 4. There were 32 Dash 4s ever built. This is one of them. And they built them in very small numbers. The Dash 5 was heading into war years. They built 155 Dash 5s. And then production ramped up at Grumman with Hellcats, Wildcats, all the rest of the stuff. Turned it over to Columbia Aircraft, and Columbia Aircraft built about 300 Dash 6s. So the J2F series in total was about 600 aircraft, and that didn't include the JF series, which was built in very limited numbers. This airplane was finished by Grumman at the end of 1939, last few months of 39. It was crated up by Grumman and shipped to Hawaii into a holding pool in the first 3 months of 1940. In mid-year 1940, they assembled it and assigned it to the 1st Utility Squadron on Ford Island. 1st Utility Squadron was on the east side of Ford Island. The 2nd Utility Squadron was on the west side. It was assigned to that in mid-1940, and they had a good time flying it. They did something like 35 surveys a day, and the boys are having a great time. I would impress upon you that the colors that are on the airplane now are not the original paint, but the original paint job. It's not a reproduction. The emblem that's on it was the emblem that was in the unit. The colors, pre-war, the bright colors. After the war started, they painted all that stuff gray, and away went the nice colors. It was in that configuration and on Ford Islands when December 7th, 1941 came along, survived that. Chuck's got pictures of ducks on the back of the hangar and smoke rising over the front, and it survived that experience. A year later, approximately a year later, in January of 43, it was shipped to New Caledonia. Now, what's the significance of New Caledonia? New Caledonia is an island that's off the east coast of Australia. It's in the southern Pacific, about 400 miles or so south of the Solomon Islands. It was the fleet headquarters, major repair depot for the shipping of the time. If a ship got shot up, it went to New Caledonia to be repaired. If it was worse than that, it went back to the West Coast. Same with airplanes. They had dry dock facilities, major aircraft reconstruction, and so on. All this stuff got shipped to New Caledonia. They offloaded it there, and they signed it to units. One of the first units in that area was at Espiritu Santos, which is in the New Hebrides, north of New Caledonia, and that was a major consolidation point for the invasion of Guadalcanal. Invasion of Guadalcanal started in August of 1942. So here's our duck arriving in New Caledonia about 6 months later after the start of the Battle of Guadalcanal. In March, this duck was assigned to CASU 3, Carrier Aircraft Service Unit 3. What do those guys do? They do all the maintenance for the groups. They're assigned to various squadrons to repair aircraft. This aircraft was, at that time, was sent to CASU 3, who was a part of Marine Air Wing 1. What's the significance of Marine Air Wing 1? They were the early guys into Guadalcanal, the first squadrons of the Cactus Air Force, and they were mostly the squadrons that covered the Solomon Island campaign. So there's our duck, CASU 3, part of Marine Air Wing 1, and it next shows up in Vala La Vala. If you look at the Solomon Islands, you've got Guadalcanal to the east, Tulagi, Savo, Rendova, Vala La Vala, Bougainville to the west. That whole campaign from Guadalcanal to Bougainville took about a year and a half. And our airplane here arrived in Vala La Vala mid that campaign. Now, the records are incomplete. I don't know whether it stayed on Vala La Vala or if it went to Bougainville, but they had seaplane bases all through those islands, a lot of them built by the Japanese. And I heard Joe Foss talk one time. Joe Foss was on Guadalcanal, and he flew in a duck, went out and do some ocean survey, or rescue, I should say, in a Dash 5 duck. A lot of records you see will reference Dash 5s or later because they built a lot more of them. So at the end of that campaign at Bougainville, the whole military moved on to the Philippines. The New Caledonia, Noumea became a backwater. Our duck here was shipped back to the West Coast and arrived back at his pool aircraft in mid-1944 in Seattle. It was then assigned to a scouting squadron, VS-50, and VS-50 did scouting in Alaska. No, they had a lot of ducks in Alaska. Coast Guard in Yakutat, Port Angeles, north of Washington, Kodiak Island. They ran a lot of ducks in that part of the world, and this was one of them. Flew out of Sandpoint. Sandpoint Naval Air Station is a naval air station right in the center of Seattle on Lake Washington, and I would have killed at been 23 next to the University of Washington, flying all day and chasing around at night. Must have been a great time. So it was with VS-50 doing scouting in Alaska for the next year and a half. Then they moved it to another maintenance unit, VS-55, and then moved it to another maintenance unit, Carrier Aircraft Service Unit 7 in Sandpoint. Now the interesting coincidence about that is there was a young guy, 18 years old, wanted to be a Navy pilot, and he was colorblind. So they washed him out and they put him in as a gunner and a radio operator in TBMs in the Pacific. He served in Okinawa, Saipan. He was on the carrier Bunker Hill. And when he left the service, they assigned him to Carrier Aircraft Service Unit 7 in Seattle. There's about a 3-month overlap when this guy and this duck were at the same unit, and that guy's name is Paul Newman, the actor. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean much. It was just an interesting kind of aside. At the end of that survey, they stricken this aircraft in 1947, shipped it to Chino, which is the old Cal Aero Field, and sold it surplus after the war. It was sold surplus after the war with a number of other aircraft, civilian owners, none of them very notable with one exception, and that was Jack Hardwick of El Monte, California. Jack, had a number of these military aircraft go through his hands, and he's responsible for saving a number of them. Aircraft ended up with an owner in Florida where they were hauling freight in the Bahamas, and so the story goes, the pilot, who was Australian, anchored this thing off in a lake in New Providence Island, which is Nassau, and decided to take off with the anchor down. He figured if I pulled the anchor, the thing would drift on the shore and get all stuck. So he tried to take it off with the anchor dragging, and it pulled the nose down, flipped it upside down, and there it lay on the bottom of the lake when I found it in the early 90s. Myself and another guy got interested. I'd been flying seaplanes for a long time, and I wanted a duck, couldn't find one, so I started collecting parts, and I started talking to everybody I knew about duck parts, and one of those guys was Dean Franklin, who was an amphib guy in Miami who had been in this business forever, and he says, hey, why don't you just go get that one over in the lake in the Bahamas? So I said, okay. So I went over and asked around, and I said, gee, let's go fly and show me the wrecks. Well, it turns out there's wrecks all over the place. That doesn't narrow the field much. And when I'm flying with this guy, he says, oh, yeah, and there's an old wrecked seaplane over in this lake. Of course, I got all excited and said, well, let's go take a look. And we overflew the wreck site. You couldn't tell it was an airplane, but you could see a little dark dot in the lake. So I got some coordinates and decided, hey, that's what I'll do. I went back to town, bought a kiddie raft, and rented some scuba equipment, and threw all the scuba equipment in the kiddie raft and paddled out in the middle. And sure enough, there was one laying on the bottom. Prop, engine, wings, tail feathers, the whole works, upside down. So I went down with a wire brush, scrubbed it a little bit, see if it was worth saving, and decided yes, it was. Went to the Bahamian government and in essence said, hey, I want that airplane. And they said, good. There's one less wreck on the island. And I went home and put my gear together in 3 duffel bags. Never forget it. 3 duffel bags, lift bags, all the accessory tools, come-alongs, everything you'd need for a limited recovery. And went down to the airport, checked in, and one of the first duffel bag was over 100 pounds. And I remember the guy at the counter said, as he groaned, he says, oh, good job. And I'm sure they'd jail you for that kind of thing today. But anyway, shuffled the stuff around the bags, got down to the Bahamas, and my friend and myself went down and began to disassemble it. Turns out that things are easier to disassemble underwater in a certain way. Water's a lubricant, so you don't have to mess with all the rust. You just sit there and wrench on it. The tough part is you're weightless underwater, and your body tends to turn instead of the nut. But we persevered, took about a week and a half to disassemble this thing and bag it up. And it was laying on the top wing, so we took the 2 bottom wings first, brought them in, and for some reason, I wanted to get the main wing, top wing next. So we lifted the airframe off of it and set it back down on the bottom, and I should have just drug it in at that point, but I didn't. So we took the main wing, drug it in, and rebagged the fuselage, only I rolled it right side up on the bottom and then brought it up engine high. You can see a picture here where the engine and the prop are breaking water, and I'm telling you, about 10 seconds after the picture was taken, that airplane rolled 180 and went back down to the bottom faster than the Titanic. So the bags were all torn up, and we were all just demoralized, and it wasn't like we had a big crew. There was 2 of us out there with our hair on fire. And so next day, we went out, and this time I thought, you know, I'm just going to bag this thing up any way I can get it. And that was upside down, and we lifted it up, drug it into shore. And as you get near the shore, it gets shallower, and I had a mobile crane standing by to hook onto it, but you couldn't get it because it wasn't close enough. Finally got near the shore, and I thought, well, I'm going to pull it in just a little closer, and the prop blades hit the shore. The whole prop power section and exhaust just fell off on the bottom of the lake, just ahead of the accessory case. So I said, okay. We brought the fuselage in, put it on a flatbed trailer, went back, retrieved the engine, pulled that out, hauled it to a yard, and I put it on a big pallet and shipped it into Miami as deck cargo on a freighter. I had one of my guys down there with a pickup trailer. We offloaded it off of the freighter right onto the trailer and headed back to Seattle, and just happy as a clam. Subsequent to that, I just started collecting parts. I found there were really couple of issues about this airplane that you should know. One, I thought 1820 engines were everywhere. They built thousands of them. So the engine was on a B-17. What I didn't know is the early generation direct drive 40 spline 1820s were about 600 to 800 horse, and the 1820-30 was specifically built for this airplane. They built 125-30 engines, and I didn't realize that at the time. I might have given up because it was so rare. But I never thought anything about it. And I'm going through the Seattle Museum one day, and I look at it and say, gee, there's a little direct drive engine. Wonder what it is. And it happened to be a Dash 30, and I ended up trading the museum for a rebuilt 1820 to fit their B-17 bomber. And they were happy, and I was happy, and that's how I got the engine for it. The other big collection issue were the instruments. All of them are just antique, and it just took a lot of hunting to find all the instruments. This doesn't even have an electric fuel gauge in it. They were operated by air. And when I first started going after the stuff, the instrument guy says there is no such thing. And so that was tough, and I started building it, and it's a big job, and pretty soon it occurred to me that I really wanted to see it fly, and I didn't have enough horsepower to do it, so I had to give way, and that's how it went to Chuck. Okay, I guess we'll talk about the restoration portion. The restoration was done by Wichita Air Service. Derek Johnson is here today, and he was with that restoration all the way through.
Yeah, Derek, would you tell us about the restoration?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you, Bill. That was great, yeah.
One of the first things everybody notices is the pile of parts here, and that's what 90% of it looks like when it comes into the shop. The first thing everybody says is, where are you going to start? And we have a saying at the shop that doing this kind of stuff is like eating an elephant. You just have to start somewhere, pick one part, and work your way through. That's all you can do. Everybody asks me, you know, how much of it's original. A good guess there is about 70%. We do have to procure parts and find, for instance, the forward section of the hull was bought. There was still quite a bit of work that needed to be done in there. Obviously, it wasn't bought from Grumman new. It was one I think came out of Alaska. Is that right, Bill? Yeah. So.
Out of a shop in Kentucky.
Or out of Kentucky. Okay.
I'll tell that story later.
Yeah, and it needed extensive repairs to it. A lot of the formers in the lower half were corroded through, along with some hatchet disassembly that was done. A lot of the parts in the airplane, Mr. Greenhill himself built and fabricated, helped us out quite a bit on a lot of the parts. We did, the wings are, I don't know, 60% probably. They're a aluminum wood wing, essentially. They're built just like the wooden rib in a wing, except it's aluminum. You can see when you've got it apart, the transition between wood to aluminum, and it's right there in that area. You know, it's not a stamped wing rib. The paint scheme, as Bill mentioned, is as it was prior to the attack, December 7th, 41. There's extensive research that went into that, the exact colors, the squadron insignia. The engine itself, as they mentioned, is one of 32 ever built. I have a lot of people tell me, you know, oh, there's several of these ducks around. They're all, you know, they're all the same, and they're not. This is the Grumman-built example, and the only Grumman-built example that we know that survives today. The Dash 6s were built by Columbia Aircraft under license by Grumman. So there's several changes, the biggest one being the engine and the horsepower rating, and we can go into detail on that with questions if anybody wants to ask, but everything in the aircraft, down to every rivet, every screw, is the exact original hardware that was used. There are rivets in this aircraft that Mr. Greenhill put on a lathe and cut to the right specifications. We went through several sources, a lot of old warehouses, things like that, found hardware that were on the shelf, took them in, having replated, and put the airplane together. The depth of the restoration that Chuck had us do was painstaking at times, but we are proud to say that it is right and it is authentic. There's not a single Phillips head screw in this airplane. It's all slot head screws, and believe me, that's not cool. It makes it very, very difficult. With the exception of some of the modern avionics that are in it for the safety purposes. But no pull fasteners. Everything is a driven rivet. There are no rib nuts, anything like that. They didn't use them then. So it is that pretty much cover it. Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, Derek. That was great, yeah. I was just going to talk a little bit about flying the airplane. We had it going, and we had a friend of mine, Dennis Sanders, did the test flights on it and got it going. We did have several problems getting it going. The propeller would not change speeds from high propeller to low propeller, and just various little things, but little things turn into days of delay. But we finally did get it going, and we brought it back to from Wichita to Kenosha. And anyway, I got checked out by Dennis in the airplane, and it flies, to use a friend's expression, if you put wings on a Winnebago, that's what it flies like. So it really is kind of a lumpy old thing. You have to push real hard and wait for something to happen, and it does respond, and it does finally go where you want it to go. Whenever I fly it, I try and go in the water with it. I like to fly airplanes in the water. And when I land in the water, I generally try to full stall the airplane so it goes into the water at the lowest possible speed. And it does. It's just a lady like you can't believe. It'll turn very easily, so I put it on the step if I get in the water, and I can do a 360 on the step and hardly get the floats wet. The airplane has a water rudder, kind of a unique thing, where on the tail both of the sides flip out independently, and there's a handle in the cockpit to engage the water rudder. So after you land in the water, we engage the water rudder, and I can maneuver it very nicely. Coming out of the water, there's none of the work that you have to do with the other amphibians trying to keep the prop out of the water, just because the prop is pretty well out of the water on this thing, and you just put the power in, and it comes right out of the water, comes on the step readily, and it runs on the step for probably a quarter mile, and then out she comes. And then it climbs kind of sluggish. 500, 700 feet a minute is the best I can get out of it. At about 80 miles an hour. The airspeed's in miles an hour. The airplane is pretty nice on the runway. When I land, it tracks pretty well, and surprisingly is very easy to handle with a crosswind. I guess it's got a huge amount of aileron, and as long as you keep the aileron into the wind, it seems to not track off the center line too badly. And anyway, that seemed to work out. Everybody said what was the biggest hurdle in building the airplane, and as I recall, the wheels and brakes were what really we just didn't know what to do with. We had new brakes, and we had one wheel that was serviceable, but we couldn't get tires. Just nobody, and I called the tire manufacturer. I says, I'll buy 100 of them. All I need is one tire. They said, no, there is no such thing as a tire for this airplane. So anyway, we found a jet wheel, and we bought the tires. These are jet tires on this thing, and we've made them look pretty much like the authentic wheel. We had to deviate, but the guys that I had talked to who flew with the original brakes didn't like them very well anyway. They would go in the water and get wet, and then they'd come back on the land and they wouldn't work. So we modified the brake from a Mallard brake. I had to build new calipers for it, and what we have is a pretty serviceable wheel and brake. Difficulty is it's a little heavier than the original brake. Probably the most difficult thing in flying the airplane is getting the wheels up. When you take off, the bring the gear up is a hand crank operation, and it's probably about 50 turns, and it is really, really hard. It just takes all the strength I have. I really congratulate these guys in World War II, these young kids. They must have had much stronger right arms than I do, but they got those gear up, and I'm really working to get the gear up on the thing. But I've done it, and we've done it hundreds of times now, and it just seems to get over it. But it does take like 5 minutes for me to get the gear up from the time we get started. One of the most frequent questions I get is, what is that wire across the leading edge on the top wing? And it's very interesting. That wire starts at the tip there, and it reaches in, goes up around the top of the wing, and there's a bungee cord holding it there. So what would happen, a pilot would bring the airplane into the dock, and he would stand in the cockpit and release the bungee cords, and then the wires would come down, and he would have a guy on the dock who would catch the wire and be able to moor the airplane or handle it on the dock without getting wet. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Sam, I see you getting up. We want to open this up for questions.
Is this thing on? Yeah, it's still on.
Yeah.
Actually, I stood up because my back hurt.
Oh.
But
Okay.
it probably would be a good time that we can open it up for questions. All right. Let me bring the mic to you, sir. One question I have, Bill, was what is your approach speed on it?
I usually approach about 85 miles an hour for both the water and the land.
You mentioned that that engine is unique to that plane. What is the differences that make it unique?
Well, the 1820 engine is generally, or in 99% of the cases, a geared engine, and it has a 50 spline propeller. And this particular engine's a direct drive engine. So this is 790 horsepower, and the same 1820 engine in its more refined power is like 1525 horsepower. And what they're doing is running the engine at a much higher RPM with the gear reduction. So the prop and the spline are 40 spline, and it's direct drive. It runs at 2,300 RPM, not very fast, and so it's a very different engine. It says 790 horsepower, yeah.
Yeah, one thing, Bill, you mentioned in there, or someone that just about having problems with the prop. Now, it's not a constant speed prop, is it?
No, it's a two-speed prop. So it's got a takeoff and landing position, and then we shift it into low prop, and it's a cruise position, and it'll cruise at 1,600 RPM with about 28 inches of manifold pressure, and then that would be the normal cruise.
I heard you fly the plane with a rag in your pocket. Can you explain that?
Yes, thanks, Terrace. The engine tends to spit oil. And anyway, what you do is if you go on a long cross country, you have to actually reach up around the windshield and wipe the oil off the windshield before you land to be able to Now, let me tell you that the biggest problem flying this airplane is you just can't see. The only thing that you see is is just out of a little corner, and even at cruise, I'm fishtailing in order to be able to see ahead of me. If I get down low where there's towers, I have to absolutely keep fishtailing in the pattern, the traffic pattern. I'm always looking for other airplanes and fishtailing. And then when you're on final, you do not see the runway. You set up and look for it. You make a sweeping turn towards the runway, and you look out the side, and then the runway disappears, and you just have to have faith that it's going to appear, and then all of a sudden you start to see the sides of the runway on both sides, and you begin your flare, and boom, boom, it's down.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Just as an aside, the war was over, and that center pontoon was great for busting haystacks when no one was around.
Yeah, there's an interesting story goes with this hull. When we were trying to accumulate parts for the airplane, we were looking for a hull. This was pretty badly damaged, and we needed some components for it. So a guy called me, and he had a museum somewhere in Kentucky or something, and he says, listen, I have a hull for a duck. Would you like to buy it? So anyway, I always negotiate. And anyway, what they had done is there was a duck somewhere, and the airplane was scrapped, but they kept the hull. And they put a trailer hitch on the back end of the hull, and this guy used it for a fishing boat. He would wind the gear down because the gear was operational. He'd put the trailer hitch on the back of his car, stuck an outboard motor through a hole in the hull, and he went fishing. And then he'd bring it back, put the gear back down, pull his motor out, attach it to his truck, and back he'd go. Well, anyway, this hull was sitting back next to this guy's hangar, and had been there for more years than and I don't think it was his hull at all, but anyway, he sold it to me, said it was. And that's the hull that you're looking at here for the most part. I mean, we took a lot of components out of it, yeah.
One more question.
Sir, you said that you bring this in and stall it basically to set it in the water. What's the stall speed?
Well, it's mid-60s, and the stall is very gentle on the airplane. It's more of a descent, or just kind of a falling type of a thing. There's no running off to the side or anything, and so that's why I like to hit the water. And I'm sure if it was a brand new airplane, I wouldn't have to do that. I would just feel comfortable driving it on like I would a goose or something else. But with this thing, I'm not really sure of the height above the water. You're really way up there when you're flying. Depth is a little bit of a problem. So this is a nice, comfortable way to land. I'll stall it, and then I'll actually feel it give up just before I touch the water, and then that roll the nose just a little forward so it doesn't bounce out, and we're in.
When these aircraft were recovered for battleship and cruiser use, where they were launched off of catapults, when they came up on the net that was being towed next to the ship, I believe they had a hook underneath the hull that would come down and hook into the net that was being towed. Is that how they recovered them?
I think so. There is a hook on the top of the airplane, which you could pick the entire airplane up with. Say it again.
He said, did they hook onto the net to pull it alongside the ship?
No, it would actually drive onto the net. The net was like a ramp. So they'd actually tug a ramp behind it was like a chain link fence almost type of material, and they would drive the airplane right up onto it. And then they would throw that hook down to the pilot, who would stand in the cockpit and actually fasten the hook to the top wing, and up he went. What a job! Are these guys tough? I mean, I wouldn't want to do that.
Oh, he wants to know how long the restoration took.
From the well, it was done in phases because the airplane went through several owners. Bill, I think you brought it out of the water, what, 92?
92.
Yeah. Okay, so Bill had the airplane for 5 years, and then I got it, and I had it for 7 years. So it was probably at least 12 years that people were working on it. And that wasn't every day all the time, but it really was just a very long, meticulous kind of a setup. It was very difficult.
When was your first flight?
In Wichita, when they right at the what was the name of that airport? Newton, right in Newton, Kansas, which is just north of Wichita, and we flew it right at the airport where it was built, where the restoration was.
And how much time do you have on it now?
I probably got 100 hours on the airplane. I've taken it to several air shows, and I try and fly it 2 or 3 times a year. Just go out and feel like it's a nice day, and I'll just fly it out and go to my neighborhood lake, Lake Fox Lake, and I beat up the lake for a little bit, and then bring it home. I never get tired of it. I don't know why I don't get tired of it, but I don't get tired of it.
Well, we really appreciate all the information, and excellent presentation, by the way. You had all that up here. You might have been making it up, and we don't know. But
No, Bill researched that.
Yeah, I know he did. But anyway, I also would like to remind you that weren't here when we started, that we have this Missions That Change the War. It's on the Warbird, not the Warbirds, the military channel, some of it. But they're for sale in here, and if you gentlemen would go in there, if they want anything to sign, I'd appreciate you going in there for just a little bit. And you too, please, sir. All right. Anybody, any other questions? We've got one more question. Yes, sir.
I remember reading about a rescue, I think where one of these ducks picked up a crew that was too big for it to take off. Are you familiar with that?
I saw the story. I think that was on that what was the name? No, it was the movie, the movie series. Not Murphy's War, but who was the guy with the Corsairs? Black Sheep. Black Sheep. Yeah, they had that on one of their series, and I don't know how true that is or not. It's a good story anyway.
Okay, folks, I thank you and appreciate your attention. And we'll see you at 1 o'clock.
Very good, Sam.
All right.